data.
Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of collaboration in using data to uncover readership behavior in media. As a data scientist at Chartbeat, I'm often asked to explore patterns of readership using our network data. Although the findings themselves are interesting, I've come to realize that doing the data analyses themselves are just half of the work. The communications of the findings to a broad audience is often just as important to bring more people into the conversation. This talk aims to demonstrate the process of collaboration and how it leads to the understanding and sharing of data. In this agenda, we are highlighting 3 studies we did about readership in media. In each one of these cases, we'll be showing the results of the research and the lessons learned during the process. Before getting into the data, I'm going to introduce Chartbeat. Chartbeat is an analytics company for publishers. There's currently more than 600 publishers in the Chartbeat network, which allows us to measure more than 65 billion page views monthly. With a broad coverage of over 70 countries, we have enough data to reasonably make insights about the state of the world in readership. To exemplify the data that Chartbeat measures, I have here on the right-hand side a screenshot of a publisher using one of our products. You can see that on this homepage, there's currently 396 users currently on the page, and most of them are viewing this page through their mobile devices. On the left-hand side, I have some of the most used features that I use when looking at Chartbeat's data. For dimensions, I'll look at the site, the page, the loyalty of the visitor, the device type that they're reading on, as well as the referral sources that they may have come from previously to get on this page, such as Facebook or Google. Metrics that I look at include page views, engage time, scroll depth, and recirculation. Recirculation is a metric that Chartbeat came up with as a proxy as to see how far our user is in the site. Using these pivots and metrics, we have an insight into the reader's journey through the publication. With all of this data, we usually ask if there are any emerging trends in publishing. At any given time, I find this to be a very overwhelming question. There's so many ways to analyze the data, and it can be really difficult to figure out which direction to even begin in. In addition, after finding out the insights, how can we share it in a way that's impactful and interesting as we find it to a general audience?
And this is where I come in. As Chartbeat's content manager, I develop the voice for collateral ranging from tweets to blog posts to conference presentations like this one. Whereas Cynthia brings the perspective of our data to our customers, I bring our customers' perspective to our data. And this allows us to uncover actionable insights from our raw findings.
Now we're going to summarize the process of how the data science and the content marketing teams collaborate to bring our media research to the public. To start, Jack and I have a standing meeting every 3 weeks to brainstorm ideas for our research. There's many different questions that people have about readers in the media landscape. This is also a place where technology is rapidly changing, so there's always something new to explore. Generally, from an idea to a completed research takes around 2 months of time to do. After selecting an idea, I would conduct the research in a notebook, like a Jupyter notebook, and note the findings in a shared document like a Google Doc, where both Jack and I have edit access. Although Jupyter Notebooks has an export to PDF functionality, moving the findings to a Google Doc is a really, really important step. Often a Jupyter Notebook has too much information and may not be relevant for Jack. And often the translation allows me to make sure that the most important methodologies and findings are passed on to him.
And after Cynthia shares her preliminary findings in this shared document, I'll then go through it to see how legible it already is to a non-technical audience and ask questions that might get us closer to that result. A big part of this is landing on the right visuals to support our research. Once I feel like I understand the data and we've talked about the value a customer would get from this particular research, I draft a version of the narrative that I then share with Cynthia to make sure it's easy to understand while staying true to her original findings.
Although these steps may seem intuitive, we're going to follow it up with 3 cases that were mentioned earlier in the agenda to demonstrate how they help us discover interesting media trends. And with that, we have our first case, which is the 80-20 rule and how it applies to publishing.
So we're all familiar with the notion that 80% of outcomes derive 20% of causes, but we were curious about how this applies to publishers. In publishing network, does 80% of engagement come from 20% of content? What about 80% of page views? And what do these distributions look like?
The lesson learned in this case is to emphasize the importance of translating data science research into formats that are digestible by the target audience. In other words, there's a lot of effort put in to make sure that the data is understandable, not just across the team, but to a general audience. Here we have 2 screenshots. On the left-hand side is a screenshot of my notebook, and in here specifically a SQL representing the data set that I used for this research. You can see here, I tried my best to make it very legible. In each of the CTEs, there are notes explaining exactly what I'm doing in each part. I think this is a very clear notebook. It's used to share with people on my team, but giving this to someone like Jack may not be the best. Jack doesn't know SQL, so as a result, what we have on the right-hand side is the shared document that both of us have. The SQL that we have on the left-hand side is condensed and summarized into the paragraph that is just right of the orange arrow. In a paragraph, I'm able to summarize how I was constructing the data set and the logic behind the work. It's really important to synthesize the SQL query in a paragraph, and this makes it a lot more understandable to Jack for him to question and see what I'm doing in my methodology. When someone understands something, they can be more engaged to ask questions, which helps with the iterative process. If you look at Chartbeat's blog a few years ago, you would mainly see that all the research will be visualized in bar graphs and line charts. There's nothing wrong with those, but there's a time and place for everything. As we advance with our research and do more complicated work, bar graphs and line charts may not be the best visualizations anymore. In this case, we have a histogram, which is a good visualization for showing distribution. When I first showed this graph to Jack, he asked me how to read it because he wasn't very familiar with histograms.
Now it's easy for me to look at this histogram and see the following. For the Chartbeat network as a whole, 80% of page views come from just 6% of articles. And when grouped by domain, most sites get 80% of their traffic from less than 20% of articles. But it wasn't that long ago that I was in the group that had never even seen a histogram. It was through working with Cynthia to understand these findings that I was better able to understand why this would be the best visual to share with our audience, what questions to ask on behalf of the audience, and how we would need to assist our readers' comprehension once we pass this information on to them.
Jack, after understanding histogram, had more questions. How does this look within our whole entire network when you stratify it by site size? And we see that the world's largest sites require fewer articles, only 14% to drive the majority of their traffic. Tiny sites, in comparison, spread the same percentage of traffic across 35% of sites.
By working together on this, we realized that visuals only go so far without explanation, and it takes a little more work to package it into something catered for our audience. So the takeaway from the data is that a small number of articles produce the majority of page views and engagement. But then the actionable insight for our audience is that it's okay to deprioritize less popular topics to focus on the smaller number of quality articles that will have the most impact.
To wrap up this case, I want to reemphasize the importance of making sure that the research is understandable. To get this outcome, we had to go through several iterations of translating the research to something digestible. With that, we're going to cover our second case, which is the optimal article length for reader engagement.
In this case, we want to know what's the relationship between word count and average engage time. In other words, is there a best length for an article?
The lesson learned in this case is constant collaboration across multiple iteration is required to deliver the optimal content. The challenge in this case was how to summarize the findings in a way that was visually appealing and interoperable. Here you see on the screen is a screenshot of my first attempt. To try to see what the optimal article length was, I did a scatter plot for each article where for each article I would be plotting its own word count with its average engaged time. In other words, every dot that you see on this graph represents an article in our dataset. I thought this was quite interesting because I saw at the bottom of the graph a slight curve that were made from the dots based on the density. You see that between 2,000 and 4,000 words, the average engaged time increases, while after 4,000 words, you start seeing it plateau and in fact see that the edge of the curve, or something that you call an edge, will fray a lot more. And that to me showed that there was a lot more variance after 4,000 words in an article. Jack didn't think this was as interesting as I did.
To me, this looked like a whole lot of blue, and while Cynthia did a nice job of explaining what the scatter plot is supposed to show, I couldn't see it at first glance, and so I knew that our audience would be similarly confused.
And that led me to my second attempt. Instead of each article getting its own dot, a particular word count would get its own dot. So here, every dot represents the median of all the average engaged time for that particular word count. You could see somewhat of a similar finding between 2,000 and 4,000 words. You still see that the average word count increases. And once again, after 4,000 words, you see that the shape does become bigger instead of the straight line that you see between 0 and 4,000 words. This to me also still showed that variance increased after 4,000 words. It was a better attempt, but Jack pushed me to do better because he felt like this still wasn't as efficient visualization. And with that, we end up with our last graph, which is a bin scatter plot. Here you see that instead of each dot showing the variance, we have a line to delimit it instead. From this graph, we can clearly see the finding, which we have on the left-hand side, which is beyond 4,000 words, variability grows in engaged time, but there doesn't mean that there is a ceiling.
So while this final iteration of the bin scatter plot now appears intuitive, it took a lot of work to get to this point. But by getting here, we were able to clearly illustrate the actionable insight that though the correlation between length and engagement is more variable for longer articles, that doesn't mean that they can't be just as engaging. They just need a little more post-publishing optimization to help you understand where readers might need help to continue consuming the content. And once we got to a clear graph, I was better able to understand the core findings and realized that I had even more questions on behalf of our audience. Because we know from previous research that people tend to read more on their phones, we wanted to see a device breakdown to understand if a higher word count kept them engaged on the smaller device. We found that though average engaged time breaks down similarly by device as it does in a larger study, we also found that though mobile referrals generate more page views, they haven't quite caught up to desktop when it comes to engagement.
There's a lot of iteration that you see, but working together helped us find the perfect visualization, allowing us to find the insight and make it a lot more clear. With that, we're going to go into our last case, which is how long do we expect a story to live?
Here, our question was essentially, what's the lifespan of an article? And to dig a little further into it, we wanted to know, does this change by referral source? And do stories driven by referral sources like social allow a story to live longer?
The lesson from this case is to gather different perspectives to unravel the bigger picture. The first issue that I had was, how do we even define what a lifespan is? This was a question that both Jack and I discussed, and we looked at a couple of different possibilities. Obviously, time was not going to be the first way to define that was the end of a lifespan, because that's exactly the question that we were trying to answer. And what we decided was to have a callback to the 80-20 rule. For us, an article reached the end of its lifespan when it reached 80% of its page views in a week after publishing. And we have here on the right-hand side a screenshot of the initial findings. So this is a curve showing the distribution of the article lifespan when you separate it out by the referral source. To me, this was not very compelling. We see that the curves look very similar, and there wasn't really anything new and different that we saw. And as a result, data science needed to revisit the data in different ways to determine if we were missing something. The second attempt required a lot more brainstorming. The original question was answered, but there was a lot more to investigate. On here on the right-hand side, I decided to break out the same article lifespan by different ways that we could break it out. We have the very top, we are breaking it out by categories. So do articles and weather have different lifespan and length than like articles in politics? We also decided to look by days of the week. There were so many different types of breakouts that we did. I think there was around 5 to 10. And to me, I kept on getting similar findings, but at the same time, we're really disjointed. At this point, I was a little frustrated just because I feel like we did a lot of work and it didn't seem like there was something interesting for me to want to show.
And though Cynthia didn't see anything special in the reconfirmed findings, I had a feeling our customers would. And so this was a good reminder for me that when we're lost in data, it's important to bring it back to the customer perspective to find the crucial information that's valuable to them. So here for publishers, the important information is not what the exact number is, but actually what the unit of the number is. And so they need to know that they have hours and not days to maximize the impact of a story in just a 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for Jack because it took a lot of collaboration for me to see the bigger picture, because for me, when looking at all of these sites that seem really disjointed, it takes a lot of help and knowledge in the media background to be able to bring that type of finding to life. And with that, we're going to go into our key takeaways. When stakeholders from different corners of the organization commit to an open and inquisitive conversation, everyone's work benefits from new perspective. Here we have the lessons from each of the cases that we highlighted below, just to really show that each one of them really benefited from collaboration from me and Jack. Although the research for me in each one of these cases has been very interesting, the work on sharing and really getting out the findings in a way that resonates with people was impossible without working with Jack.
Yeah, and left to our own devices, we each have our own expertise. And so Cynthia knows where to start a data investigation, and I know where to finish it for our audience. But it's the collaboration that happens in the middle, the questions that are asked, and the perspectives that are added. That's what really makes these projects successful and ultimately valuable to our readers.
The note that I would like to leave off on is collaboration is essential to storytelling with data. You can find the most interesting facts, but it's not as impactful if it's not shared in a way that's accessible to everyone. And with that, that's the end of our presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.